Hey, welcome back to JG3 Reviews. My name is James, and around here I like to explore the world of fountain pens, ink, and paper. And in that exploration, I started a while back a sub-collection, I guess I'd call it, of pens from around the world. I'm trying to find pens from as many spots on that map as I can. However, some countries are really way overrepresented. I don't know which pen is really the German pen, or even which pen would be the American pen, and I certainly don't know which pen would be the Chinese pen, but I think today's might be a contender. You see, I like to find a pen that either has a significant representation of pen users in that place. So like Germany might be a Lamy 2000, or maybe just the humble Lamy Safari. An American pen might be a vintage Esterbrook J or something like that. Some countries it's harder to find pens from, and it's easier than to settle on a pen. I take what I can get, right? China, I'm overloaded in pens because it's a great time to be a fountain pen user if you are able to order pens from there. There are big names like Jinhao and Wing Sung that make some really good, affordable pens. There are smaller businesses like Pen BBS or Asvine that are making some absolutely excellent pens. So we really are spoiled for choice. But I think today's pen, I think it makes a lot of sense for it to be the one that represents recent Chinese history, no matter how mixed that history really is. And that is the Hongdian 100. And I say it's controversial because this pen was originally commissioned a couple of years ago to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party. And that's not something I celebrate. It's probably not something a lot of you would celebrate. But that's what sparked the commissioning of this pen. What I want to look at the pen for is more objective than that, and that is the design, the function, and the embossing or stamping of the pen. And I think it's actually really well done, and I can appreciate this in the same way that I would look at, for example, some of the artists. We lived in Russia in 1995, and some of the old murals from the Soviet era celebrating, for example, Yuri Gagarin going into space was next to a little grocery shop I used to go to all the time, and I could appreciate the artistry and the excitement about space exploration of that without getting excited about the communist regime that put it up on that wall in the first place. There's just an objectivity that we ought to be able to have in looking at someone's work or design, and that's how I'm going to approach this pen. If you don't like that, I got plenty of other reviews that you can look at and won't have any problem with, but I think this is an interesting pen with some good design, with very good function, with one asterisk, which I will get to, and I'll share with you how I fixed the problem that I had with a part of this pen. So if you can wade through all of that with me and stick with me, let's spin that camera and take a look at what I think is actually kind of a cool fountain pen. And let's start with a general overview of the pen. So this is an almost all-metal pen, the main cap and body being made of aluminum. You have this very chunky clip, which you will notice is mounted there on spring steel and is incredibly stiff. And I actually have two of these, and both of them have that same issue. So it seems to be consistent. And the build overall seems to be quite consistent between the two. At the finial, you have, in my sample, a silver finial with that star. Now, some of these models did come with a red star and even some gold trim around this. And in fact, there is a higher end model of this with red inlay inside the design of this. And I think you can still get those, but they're quite expensive. They come with a gold nib. It was a definite upmarket version of this pen. Coming down that cap, you will notice, of course, all of that ornate stamping on this pen, and it's really impressively done. It kind of reminds me, I guess I have my head now in our time in Russia back in the 90s, and it kind of reminds me of the metalwork on a podstakanik, or a tea glass, a Russian tea glass, the metal holder. They would use this same technique to decorate those. Kind of reminds me of that. As you come down, you see that this is really nicely rounded, and so when you have the pen posted, for example, and it does post, that is not uncomfortable. Of course, for me, it kind of falls where it wouldn't be anyway, but if it fell like that, that's not sharp at all. It's comfortable, no problem, so that is helpful. Then when you come down to the barrel, You see some architectural elements and things in that design of that pen. You see the Great Wall, and you see this palace. Really well done. And I think they've done just an excellent job, and especially when you consider that this pen retails for $30. Sometimes you can get it even for a little bit less in the upper 20s. And there aren't many pens with this level of construction at that price range that you're going to be able to find, and that makes it impressive, I think. And then you come down to that blind cap, which itself is nicely done. It's grooved like on the edge of a coin so that you get really good grip, and that piston runs nice and smoothly. This is the empty pen, and that too is just well done. Everything on the outside of the pen is well done. Now, it is a piston filler, and for those who aren't familiar, I've gotten one of these demonstrators out to show you what's going on. Inside of this pen works the same way as this one. Now, this has, as we'll see in a moment, a metal assembly for the piston drive, where this one is plastic. But when you turn the knob, that piston goes down, it forces out the air, and then when you tighten it back down, it draws in by vacuum ink. And you would do that usually about 3 times. If you want a really good fill, that's usually going to give you about the maximum for any given piston filler, and then you're good to go. People like these kinds of pens because they're great with bottled ink. Of course, that's all they can use, and they have a larger ink capacity than a standard converter or cartridge pen. Plus, some of us just kind of geek out on different filling mechanisms, and, it's a pen thing. Now, if we remove the cap, it takes about 1 1/4. Let me double check that. There's one. Yeah, about 1 1/4 turns. So it's a quick uncapping pen. It does post just fine and securely. And as we can see with the help of the O-Pen Glow, there is a plastic liner, and that helps prevent dry out. And I've not had problems with dry out with this pen. It's been quite reliable that way. Now, this is the empty pen, and so I will use it to show you that there is an ink window, and it's quite sufficient. It's kind of a smoky color, so it's not just perfectly clear looking through there, but as you can see, if this pen had ink in it, we would definitely know. The grip section is also metal, but it has an almost lightly brushed finish, and it does not slip. I find it very comfortable to write with, and the pen overall has a nice balance. It's long enough. I write with it most of the time unposted. Again, it can be posted, but it's going to be back weighted. Just a comfortable pen. By the way, if you're familiar with the Hongdian N7, you're basically looking at the same pen, just in a metal-clad version. So your blind cap on the N7 is plastic. You have this nice acrylic barrel, and you do have a metal cap. The section is going to feel somewhat the same, because this is a metal section as well. And so if you're familiar with this, you kind of know what this pen is like in terms of dimensions and everything else, and you're going to know what the pen is like as far as the nib, because as you can see, it's using the same nib unit. It's just not blackened like the one on this Moon Rabbit pen. But they are interchangeable, which means, for example, I have the long knife version in this pen, but if I wanted an extra fine, nowadays, even a medium, I would be able to get that and use that in this pen. No problem whatsoever. Now, I've pulled out this empty one because I do want to show you some things about maintaining this pen first. As I said, this is a nib unit, and it does unscrew. You can also, by the way, pull this nib from the unit, and you can swap that with some other number 6 nibs. I'm not sure which nibs are all compatible. Some people have had success swapping number 6 Yovo nibs into this unit. You should know there is a silicone O-ring inside here that you'll want to be sure and get back in there, but you can just pull that nib and feed. It's a typical plastic feed. I'm not going to bother pulling that, but that is an option. And while I've got this in my hand, though, let's look more closely at this long knife nib. This is made especially for Chinese characters so that you can get varying widths depending on approach and angle, and it does a good job at that. A lot of people like to use them too, just to add some more character to their standard Western writing. Some people seem to get out of sorts because you're not using it right, but I think this is a your pen, your writing your way, mind your business kind of a sort of thing. Now, being able to remove that nib, of course, makes this an even easier pen to wash out and to clean and service, and I have actually done that with the pen that I have inked. I've cleaned that pen out a couple of times already. To fully do that, you will need a tool. Now, some pens come with a Hongdian tool, which is simpler than this one. This is the newer combination Hongdian Asvine tool that I got in a recent order. And what you do to use this is you find that slot with that piston knob open on both sides. You slip that in there, and it's easier if you then tighten back down a little bit so that it holds your wrench in place. And then to open is counterclockwise, and you can open that up. Or you can hold it and do that. And then you will find this metal insert. Now, on some pens, this is going to be brass. This is a lighter metal, probably an alloy, feels like, of some sort. But you can service this pen, put silicone grease, whoops, that's already been done, but you can put silicone grease there on that piston, and that just helps keep your pen in better service. But very, very simple to do and to take care of. And then, of course, to reinstall it, you just remember George Costanza and do the opposite. Again, replace that nib unit. It's as simple as screwing that back in. Just be careful not to grab onto that feed in a way that could damage it. And as I said, that can be pulled and nib swapped with other brand nibs as well. Now let's do a quick size comparison. There is the Hongdian 100. Next up, also from my Pens Around the World collection, this is a Gravitas Flagship with laser etching. Really nice pattern. Can't wait to share that pen with you. And here is the CaliArts Ego that I used to demonstrate the piston mechanism, and a Jinhao X159. Many of you have that pen. So unposted and lined up end to end. You can see that this is not an overly long pen at all, but I think it's long enough to write with unposted for most users, and it's going to be a comfortable pen to write with. And here we have the pens in their posted length. The Gravitas, of course, does not post. All right, I mentioned that I had a problem with this pen, and you may be thinking that I skipped it, but I didn't. My problem was with that long knife or long blade nib. And my problem was that my pen wrote so dryly that it was pretty much unusable, very frustrating. It was ink-starved altogether. There was also a little bit of a catch, I think. It just wasn't quite smoothed out as much as it should have been. Now, let me say, that is actually the first time that I have had a nib that needed that much tuning from Hongdian. Many of them write excellently out of the box. So it was a bit of a surprise to me, and it was really kind of frustrating. But I did eventually get it tuned the way I like, and I'll share with you what I did. Now, the first thing I did was to get out this micro mesh pad. I believe I got this from maybe Goulet. It's been very well used, as you can see, and this red ink is from working over this pen. And what I typically start with is some figure eights, and just several figure eights, and then move over to a new spot, move over to a new spot, checking it in between every few, because you don't want to take too much material. Do this lightly. Don't bear down on it. Just work on smoothing that nib and check often. The more often you check, the less likely you will overdo it and end up with a pen that's really worse than when you started. Now, you can look up several different variations of this technique. I think I picked mine up from Goulet Pens and from their channel on YouTube, and I find that it works quite well. And then I did downstrokes and upstrokes and left and then right, and then a few circles both directions, and checked it again. And at that point, I had the smoothness that I was looking for. Now, I made sure, because this is a long blade nib, to do this in a way where I'm also working the angles of that nib, because you're not dealing with a pen that you're going to write from the same angle all the time, and you don't want to create a flat spot in that curved nib. So do that too. Make sure that you're actually doing this with that complete writing surface. But it was still too dry. So I used then the technique that probably many of you know, where you will write straight lines, putting just, I'm not going to mess up my nib now that I have it where I want it, but where you will just write some lines using moderate pressure, just enough to gently start to move those tines apart. These were very clearly, they were way too tight. And so I was trying to just work them out to get the space that they need for ink to flow in between. You don't want to spread them. It's not a flex pen, and this is very stiff nib. You just want to create the proper opening for that ink channel. So that's what I did. And I did that several times, and it just still was ink starved. And I will tell you, so stiff that it was very difficult to create any space there. So that's when I went even farther. You can see that I have a well-worn piece of brass sheet here. And I worked that brass sheet. I had to do two things. I worked in between the tines several times, checking every single time to make sure that it was going to be okay. But I worked that through in between, and then I really only had a breakthrough after I worked it between the nib and the feed. Now that you've got to be very careful, because the sharpness of that brass sheet can damage a plastic feed. So you have to be very careful. You can't just drive it up in there. You're not flossing an elephant's teeth here. You've got to be very, very careful going in there and mindful of how little space there is. You're not wanting this pen to leak ink later, and you're not going to want to damage your plastic feed. So I gently worked that brass sheet in between the nib, not going up all that far actually, before I finally was able to get what I wanted. And then I cleaned the pen again in case anything I might have knocked loose might clog it, and then re-ink the pen. And now I have a very good writing pen with excellent ink flow, as you'll see here in just a second. So this is the Hongdian 100, and the nib is called either a long blade or a long knife. And what that means is that it's made for Chinese calligraphy. Now it has a very thin downstroke and a thick side to side, and it does vary. This is low, this is normal, this is high. It may be hard to pick up, but there is variation there, and it makes for some neat quick strokes as well. It just kind of gives those some character that I kind of like. Show you from the diagonal. It kind of exaggerates those differences. And so as you can see, you could use that for a lot of different things. It's very useful in Chinese characters, but it does also offer some character for Western writing that you wouldn't get from a rounded nib. Ink is Diamine. Red Dragon. Thought that was appropriate for a pen from China. Now let's try for wetness. And as you can see, this pen is no longer ink starved. This was a very successful tuning for what I was looking for and what I was hoping it would be when I was done, and I'm very happy with the way that this pen has turned out. And I ran out of room. As you can see, this pen just writes with a nice broad line on the left to right stroke or right to left stroke, and makes for some interesting color variation as well as you're going quickly. And I like it. I really like the way that it's turned out once I got it working properly. Now, I guess the ultimate test of this and whether or not it worked is going to be the speed test, and we'll see if I can keep that nib at the right level while I do it. All right, so you see a few places where maybe, I don't know that it was not keeping up. It does get lighter at times still, but I think in a way that I like. Some of these I know were me, not so much lifting as you really have to keep that in a nice spot there. Let's show you what I'm talking about here. You notice if you go to the right, it gets lighter, and so that's when you're going to kind of skip a little bit. But overall, I think it's working quite well now, and I really enjoy riding with the pen. So it's gone from a really pretty dud to a really good-looking working pen that is really quite pleasant to use. So there you have it. I think this is a great pen to add to your collection because it shows some really nice craftsmanship on their part in this stamping, and it shows some creativity. It's certainly not a knockoff of anything. If you're trying to find a good Hongdian and you don't want anything that looks like anything else, or a good Chinese pen that doesn't look like anything else, well, I think this does accomplish that, and does it in a creative way and in a well-made way. In general, you're not going to have the nib problem that I had. This is really the outlier in my experience with Hongdian, so I wouldn't be too worried about that. Just know that sometimes you get a fountain pen, even from a very consistent maker, and you're going to have to do a little bit of tuning. And really, that's part of the hobby and part of the game. And in this case, it really did all end well. I will say, too, look forward to an ink review sometime in the next couple of weeks because I'm going to review this. It is one of my favorite standard red inks, and I think complements this particular nib quite well. Well, there you are. Tell me what you think about the pen, what you think about those long blade, long knife nibs. Share all of that in the comments. As always, thank you for liking, sharing, and subscribing. And God bless you, and have a great week.